Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Silver Bullet Podcast. I'm Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnich.
And Chip, this week we are talking about another Ohio State win, but this time a win over a team that maybe some people around the country respect a little bit in TCU.
Absolutely. I think congratulations to Ohio State on a well-deserved victory. It was very shaky. I'm sure we're going to get into it in greater detail. Offensively, they were inconsistent at times. The defense was on their heels, at least throughout the first half. Last week we predicted, a close game. My final prediction was 42-23. The final score was Ohio State 40, TCU 28. So I guess in the spirit of the Price is Right, I would have gone over and been disqualified in terms of my point prediction. But in all sincerity, I thought TCU represented the Big 12 very well. I think they have a bright future ahead of them for the remainder of the 2018 season.
Yeah, I agree. I think I picked a close game. I think I picked an 8-point game, a 34-26 game. So we both were in the neighborhood on that, and we both expected, a fairly close game. And, this was a game where you knew there was going to be some plays made by both teams. And I think, a lot of people seemed to raise their eyebrows early with TCU moving the ball easily. But, once you got past those scripted plays, I didn't really panic. I thought once you get past the scripted plays and the game slows down to a more normal pace, I think Ohio State's defense will be all right. There's just no way TCU was keeping up that frantic of a pace for the entire 60 minutes.
I agree with you. And I think what was kind of surprising as I reflect on the game, it was only a few days ago, was that we were well prepared for TCU in the sense of they're going to, try to, in terms of, with their receivers, try to, get them in space. And I give them a lot of credit for that. It was well executed in its intention, but not in its overall design, with the kickoff return that was called back because it was a forward pass. Mm-hmm. I thought it was ingeniously designed. I think the consensus would be that Ohio State got down there on their kickoff coverage faster than TCU was anticipating, which kind of forced the forward pass. But as I look back on it, and I guess I'm kind of anxious for your perspective, is that I'm kind of surprised that TCU did not run Robinson more from the quarterback position because of his mobility. I think that could have definitely helped TCU more than I thought. He played well with the obviously he had the interceptions that, and we'll talk about that with Draymond Jones, and Malik Harrison at the end, but. I thought he played well, but I was expecting him to be more of a designed runner on plays for TCU. Maybe you have a different perspective.
No, you and I talked about it last week, that we thought that was a situation where TCU could take advantage of Ohio State's deficiencies at linebacker and safety, and that really didn't come into play. I mean, for whatever reason, they didn't choose to run him. Maybe they were not wanting him to take a bunch of hits, knowing how physical Ohio State's defense can be, or whether they just had a different game plan in mind. But they definitely, they did some of the things we expected with some quick screens and getting the ball out fast and maybe attacking the edges a little bit, especially they had the one long touchdown run that was kind of off the edge. But for the most part, I thought Robinson would be a dual threat quarterback, and they really kept him pretty well contained.
I agree with you, and since you brought up the deficiencies at safety, it was not. Well, he was involved. Jocelyn Wint was involved later in a long pass that we can kind of reflect on. But Isaiah Pryor, he took a bad angle, which contributed to that 93-yard touchdown run by TCU's Anderson. Of course, the television was quick to point out this is the longest touchdown run in TCU history. And, oh, by the way, it's the longest run against an Ohio State defense in Ohio State history. So something has to change. I'm not sure what that is. And I think you would probably agree with me that Alex Grinch has forgotten more about secondary coaching than you and I possibly know. But something has to change in terms of the composition of that secondary. I'm not sure. I agree with our colleagues at the Ozone, Tony Gerdeman and Tom Orr, with the suggestion that possibly moving Sean Wade to safety this week against Tulane, with the idea that if he's going to take his lumps, at least it's against Tulane, and kind of get the kinks and the mistakes out of his system. Hopefully by the time Ohio State goes on the road to Penn State in a couple of weeks, possibly. I've heard some other people suggest the idea of Josh Proctor, who was one of the true freshmen who was kind of lauded by Urban Meyer back in the spring as being a potential contributor. I've read online the idea of possibly moving Okuda back to safety. That was a position he played in high school, maybe getting Brendan White in the mix. The point being that there's something that it just is not gelling back there, because throughout the spring, if you recall, there was always this talk about Isaiah Pryor being the starter, but Urban Meyer just seemed to kind of hedge his bets when he would talk to the media about conclusively saying that Isaiah Pryor was the starter. And now, 3 games into the season, there have been enough bad plays in terms of poor angles and missed tackles that have led to long runs. When you think back to Oregon State, you think back to Saturday night against TCU, that maybe Urban Meyer was trying to be, I guess maybe foreshadowing, if you will, of some of the challenges that he foresaw from that safety position.
Yeah, I don't mind the suggestion of putting Sean Wade in there. It's as long as he gets to be more of the cover safety than necessarily the roamer. But he's a guy that I really like his pass defense. I really like his coverage skills. So I don't want to see that go away. Yeah, Pryor and Wint have both had their issues. I know Wint on the long pass, the one that I know, was it Chris Fowler that did the game?
Yes.
Continuously talking about what a brave throw Robinson made. No, it was a dumb throw. He threw into double coverage. It was really stupid, and he got away with it because Wint lost sight of the ball. And instead of just tackling the guy and giving up the 15 yards, he gives up the touchdown. It was not a brave play. It was let's not call it brave when a guy does something dumb. You can say, oh well, he had so much trust in his receiver. You don't throw into double coverage. I mean, come on. It's if you do it and you succeed, great, but you got away with it.
I agree with you, and I also believe that let's give. I mean, instead of continually harping on the bad safety play, let's laud the positive plays from Jordan Fuller at the safety play, because he came up with some crucial tackles that, especially in the second half, that when the momentum started to go in Ohio State's direction, Jordan Fuller, you talked earlier about, the screen plays that were hurting Ohio State earlier in the game. Jordan Fuller coming up and making those clutch tackles that either were for loss or for no gain or minimal gain. Jordan Fuller played, I thought, a very solid game from his safety position.
He really did, and it's not even close. It's Jordan Fuller and then a long gap between him and the next closest safety. Fuller not only did a good job at blowing up those screens, but even sometimes he would read the play quickly and come up and take out 2 blockers and allow someone else to make the play. He was really doing well in there, and it was we would definitely be remiss if we didn't point out the good to go along with the bad. So Ohio State comes out and just basically goes down the field. Austin Mack with a big first drive, and then the drive bogged down. The first one, the second down play there, Haskins, all he has to do is lollipop it out there, and he throws a line drive, gets it knocked down. He's got a sure touchdown to Rashad Berry. And then the next one, he's got a wide open Austin Mack, and Mack had a case of the dropsies. A little bit of the yips. I mean, he made 2 really good catches on the opening drive, and then he dropped 3 or 4 easy ones before he kind of got back in the groove. I want to talk about Austin Mack a little bit with you, Chip, because a lot of people were in my timeline talking about bench him. He should never see the field the rest of the game. And I kept saying, let's look at the opposite side of that. Yes, he's dropping the ball, but he's also getting open. And if he's continuing to get open, he's going to continue to get the ball, and he's going to eventually start catching these again, because Austin Mack's a pretty good receiver. So my thought was not bench the kid and make a situation worse. My thought is let's let him play through it. I think Ohio State's doing well enough that he can get through this, and by the end of the game, he did.
And I agree with you. I think Austin Mack, I mean, it was very unfortunate. I mean, he to start off with such a spectacular play at the onset, and then, as you said, he kind of the drops, Ohio State had to settle for a field goal. That was kind of when I said earlier in the podcast, offensively, Ohio State was so inconsistent. I mean, the fact that they'd move the ball and then it just seemed like they would bog down and have to settle for field goals instead of touchdowns, like when they would get in the red zone. And I want to give credit to TCU again. Like they were contributing to that, but Austin Mack's drops certainly did not help with that. If anything, not only did he work his way through it, I thought another wide receiver who came up with clutch plays in terms of being able to keep drives going when Ohio State needed a big play, he would provide it, was KJ Hill. I thought KJ Hill had a very solid game, bailing Ohio State out. I mean, there was earlier in the game, coming up with, on a couple, clutch receptions earlier that eventually led to Ohio State. KJ Hill. I'm just looking at some of the notes that I had. He on a crossing route, he came up KJ Hill on the sidelines coming up with a reception. Terry McLaurin had one, which right before the half, Sean Nurenberger missed the field goal. Like I said, it was just the maddening inconsistency of the first half of Ohio State would be running the ball and then they'd go away from it and then they'd bog down. I mean, J.K. Dobbins at first wasn't able to run the ball. And then by the end of the game, he was, which also goes back to what we talked about last week, that offensive line being able to assert its physical dominance over TCU just almost by attrition, wearing down TCU. And that's when those plays started to become more and more positive. But I certainly agree with you that Austin Mack, for those people that were on, the grumpy old Buckeyes timeline here, telling, speaking of benching, that's not going to happen because it's a credit to Austin Mack for his toughness and resilience that, to battle through, those internal demons, if you will, to, not give up on himself. It's also a credit to Dwayne Haskins for maintaining the confidence in him that even though, you from what I understand, Dwayne Haskins alluded to that in one of the comments he made, to the press that, I'm going to keep going to him, like I knew he'd work his way through it. So I think Austin Mack, he had a rough night, but by the end of it, it seemed like he had turned it around.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of the things I hate to see is for a kid to face a lot of grief, especially now with social media and everything being what it is, and those kids, they're just like everybody else. They check their social media, and it can get pretty ugly. And I thought this is a kid who's getting open. He's doing a lot of things well. He's not going to keep dropping balls. He's going to make another play. If you just keep giving him a chance, he's going to make another play. And there were other guys on the field that were not as quite as adept at getting open against TCU's secondary, which was, I thought TCU's secondary played pretty well for the most part. I think Ohio State got a little bit vanilla at times, though, which kind of helped them because we didn't see as much variety. We didn't see a whole lot of going to the tight ends. They threw to Barry a couple times, or at least in his direction, but we didn't see the other tight ends involved. We didn't see much of Benjamin Victor, although the one play that stands out is Victor made a great route, did the little stop and go, and was wide open, and Haskins underthrew him. That was a sure touchdown. You would expect that Haskins would make that throw more often than not, but in this particular case, TCU was pressure and knocking him around a little bit may have affected him in terms of just being slightly not quite himself on that play and a little bit underthrown, and Victor still almost came up with the catch.
Yeah, I mean, you could see the frustration by Victor that, like if he had led me, because he knew I agree with you that was a touchdown. You know, like it was underthrown, which was uncharacteristic of Dwayne Haskins, who, by the way, you know, I thought, you know, he was getting pressured, but he kept his eyes downfield, was, you know, throwing the ball away instead of, you know, forcing the ball into traffic. I thought Dwayne Haskins, this is the kind of game, not that you want it to be, you know, something that is, you know, that's going to shatter or rattle his confidence. But this is the kind of game that I think even though Ohio State coaches probably want Dwayne Haskins to have, and then kind of work his way through it, you know, because they know that in a couple weeks when they go on the road to Penn State, when they, you know, let's face it, you know, when they go on the road to Purdue, you know what I'm saying, like to East Lansing in November, to Michigan State, they're going to be much more difficult, hostile environments. And, you know, we were kind of talking earlier about the composition of the crowd. Yes, Ohio State traveled well, but I don't know, maybe this is just one person's opinion. I think this qualified as a you can call it the announcers can call it a neutral site game. All I know is TCU, those players, they got to sleep in their own beds and they bust across, and Ohio State had to hop on a plane. So to me, I call this a road game. That this was Ohio State's first true test of the season, and Dwayne Haskins responded. You know, he played very well, no interceptions, and was able to, you know, as well as he could, keep his eyes downfield, even with the pass rush. And, you know, he did everything he could to keep drives alive. Like I said, sometimes they'd sputter out, but I thought Dwayne Haskins played extremely well against a very talented opponent.
Yeah, his numbers were really good, and when you consider that he had some drops, not just from Mac, but a couple other receivers dropping some balls, they could have been even much better. And there were only a few times, I think, when he was under pressure, needed to throw it away or made a bad throw that I saw somebody that, okay, he was open, Dwayne didn't see him, maybe didn't have time to make that check down or to go to the next progression. There were only a couple of times that I can recall that, but I think that he handled himself quite well, and he was very calm. You know, he's always calm under game pressure, but the physical pressure of the pass rush and the blitzing and people knocking him around, that was something we really hadn't seen yet if Dwayne Haskins could handle, and I thought he handled it really well. So he passed a big test, and I think that will serve him well going into conference play.
Something else to kind of talk about, I'm not sure if you noticed this on your timeline, because I certainly did, and that is the idea of Dwayne Haskins with the zone read. You know, he needs to take it himself. He needs to, and finally he did. You know, when Ohio State was in, you know, scoring position and was able to, you know, he kept instead, and, you know, made that was actually the touchdown, you know, that he kept, which was the final touchdown that Ohio State scored, you know, in the fourth quarter. You know, at that point, J.K. Dobbins was running well, but the point being that, you know, it's such a fine line for Dwayne Haskins, because mobility, it's not to imply that he can't run, but that's not his strong suit. It just isn't.
Right.
And I think that the defense, they're going to continue to crash down on the running game. It doesn't matter on the running back. It doesn't matter if it's Dobbins, if it's Weber, if any of the true freshmen get in there, which they didn't on Saturday night against TCU. But, you know, at some point, I'm sure Urban Meyer is going to probably have to get in his ear and say, I need you to start, I don't think it's a fear thing. I think it's not in his comfort zone to carry, because that's not part of his, it's just not part of his natural game.
Right. And they're taught, if you don't feel comfortable keeping it, just go ahead and hand it. If you don't feel it, just give it to the running back, because you know what those guys can do. And that's why TCU is crashing down, because, I mean, if you're TCU, you don't care if Haskins runs. You know, Dobbins is a guy who can bust a play for 80 yards. Dwayne Haskins is probably not going to run an 80-yard touchdown.
Yeah, without it, I mean, now let's face it. Like last year, up in Ann Arbor, when they show the highlights, and he's accumulating so many highlights this season, it's not going to be as relevant. But when I'm sure you recall last year up in Ann Arbor, Haskins on a long run down, and almost scored a touchdown, but that wasn't on a zone keep. That was on a pass play when he dropped back to pass and he was flush from the pocket, and then he took off running. Mm-hmm. My point being is that he has decent enough mobility, but I think he's better served, and I think Ohio State's better served by recognizing, all right, he can run, but how about, let's, instead of the zone read per se, how about when he drops back to pass, and if he sees the pressure and can gain positive yardage running that way. But that's just, I go back to what I said earlier, that I know that Urban Meyer, he wants that to be part of the offense. But I just think, like you said, the defense, they're going to continue to crash down on Dobbins, Weber, whoever it might be, because they're not thinking that Haskins is going to keep it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I thought was great was, if the Yahoos on Twitter can see it, then that Ryan Day and Kevin Wilson can see that they're crashing down. But the great thing, too, is that they really kind of didn't force the issue. They made sure they called the play when it was going to be effective. I don't know if you caught much of – you probably didn't, because why would anybody watch the Miami Dolphins? But the Dolphins played the Jets on Sunday, and Ryan Tannehill – I think he only had 4 runs in the zone read, and all 4 of them were highly successful runs. I think he ended up with like 47 yards rushing and some key first downs late when they were trying to run out the clock. And I think the whole thing is, if you don't run the quarterback often, it's extremely successful when you do, as long as you're making the right read, obviously. But if Haskins can keep that in his pocket, and say, okay, we'll take a 2-yard gain here and 2-yard gain there. Maybe we'll pass up a 6-yarder here, but we're going to get that 6 or 8-yard run when we really need it.
I agree with. I think that holding on to those plays, down in, especially like the way that it turned out, Ohio State was in the red zone. They were within scoring position. And that's when, deciding to keep it, that's when it truly paid dividends for Ohio State. One of the things that Tony Gerdeman and Tom Moore said in their post-game Facebook Live, / Across the Field podcast is there were a lot of people saying, oh, like they need to bring in, Tate Martell, and that way, they'd be able to play that part of the offense. But I'm more of the mindset that, all right, well then TCU knows that's going to be the strategy.
Right. It's not fooling anybody when you're bringing in the running quarterback. He might run it.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, if anything, that Haskins, I go back to what I said a few moments ago, that this was a well-coached, talented team that Ohio State, they were in, some adverse situations. Haskins kept playing well, and Ohio State came out ahead. A player we haven't mentioned yet, but it just kind of seemed eerily prophetic for both of us, I think, was we talked about what happens when Paris Campbell, when he when he turns the corner, when he's able to square up his and just get going, because that was when Ohio State, they took the lead, or excuse me, they didn't take the lead, but they were able to get back into the game. Now granted, they were down at the time 21-13. There was that controversial targeting call that was and wasn't, and I'm just, the whole targeting thing is just a debacle, no matter if you're talking for TCU or for Ohio State. I just, the whole thing, on a national scale. But getting back to Paris Campbell, he had that touchdown that got Ohio State back in the game. And then it was only, on the very next series that Draymond Jones had the interception that put Ohio State into the lead that they never relinquished.
Yeah, I think Paris Campbell, it seemed almost like they were forcing some things to try to get Campbell involved, and then they kind of went away from him for a long time, and then hit him with that slip screen, and it was the perfect play call at the right time. And I think it was Pridgeon, who had two fantastic blocks on the same play, and sprung that, and it was just it was a huge play and it kind of got that that 3-score explosion started, and really helped Ohio State get back into it. But I never really felt Ohio State was out of it. The long run obviously annoyed a lot of people because it was it harkened back to the Oregon State game, and at the time it put TCU ahead, and you get the Pat Forties of the world, and these guys who are all like, ooh, TCU having Ohio State on the ropes, and I'm like, it's a second quarter, relax, Val, relax, fella. But yeah, it was for me. Okay, the game started about how I thought it was. It was physical. You get down there, you make a couple mistakes, and you have to settle for the field goal. And I'm like, you always get that big game. Why are we bringing field goals to a touchdown fight mentality early? Then you get the ball back. You got to punt. So, Drew Chrisman does his job, pins him deep, and then you get Nick Bosa showing up to wreak havoc in the backfield, creates a fumble, and Davon Hamilton falls on it. I'm not sure how Draymond Jones missed that ball. And then, then of course they're saying, well, they're so lucky. The ball was on the end line. It should have been a safety. And, I looked at that play. I don't know how many times they showed it, and I also watched it on my own about another 50 times. And I can't tell if it's touching him while his foot is on the line. You see kind of from the above angle, his foot is certainly over the line, but you can't tell if it's on the ground from that angle. I don't think it's anything they overturn,
Right. Watching it at home, like you said, it's unfortunate, that, that was one of those crucial plays that Nick Bosa made. As you said, Davon Hamilton, was there as the beneficiary of a great play by Nick Bosa. And I'm not sure, in terms of, did the officials miss it? Was it, should it have been a safety? That was the part of the game where watching it at home, like you, I never felt that Ohio State was out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I simply felt the defense at their even with the fact that TCU was successful, like at one point, that's when, later on that Damon Arnett was beaten deep on a pass interference call, and then TCU was able to Olanua, or I think I'm pronouncing that right. Olanua, their running back, ran for a touchdown, which gave them the lead to make it 10-7. The point being is, I thought at that point the pass rush with Nick Bosa, that the defense was keeping Ohio State in the game. Like I said, that there were frustrating things where, it seemed like the Ohio State running game would get going, and then the next thing there was, Ohio State at a 3rd and 6, and Rashad Berry had a false start that pushed it back, and those kind of things. It's like Ohio State, they were able to get going, and we already talked about poor Austin Mack with the dropsies and things like that. And it just seemed as though like the defense would play well, and then we talked about the long touchdown. But it just kind of, I don't know, to use a very strange analogy, kind of almost like, teaching someone how to drive a stick shift car. Like it was like a lot of like herky jerkiness on both sides of the ball, offense, defense, a lot of grinding, and then they just finally like they would play well. And then just, again, like, then there would be plays that would make you mad. And, this is the kind of game that you want. Obviously, coming out ahead was the end result, but the simple fact is that a lot of players, like after Nick Bosa went out, they truly stepped up their game. Like Damon Arnett played better in the second half. We talked about Draymond Jones, who was the well-deserved beneficiary of the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. Another guy who I think is completely forgotten about on that Ohio State defensive line, and it's just because he plays the same position as Nick Bosa and Chase Young. Jonathan Cooper had a very solid game. he came up, with he wasn't nearly as prolific as Draymond Jones, but he had a sack earlier in the game. So I mean, there are a lot of guys. We talked about. I mentioned earlier about Malik Harrison. The linebackers, they were struggling at times earlier in the first half, but Malik Harrison really seemed to kind of step up his game in the second half. He had that clutch interception that basically ended the game, for Ohio State, with only a couple minutes left in the, in the fourth quarter. So I agree with you that I think that, offensively, defensively, yeah, there were some things that Ohio State needs to work on, in terms of, you talked about Malcolm Pridgeon, that Michael Jordan had, another thing on the timeline that a lot of the low snaps that never turned into an issue, but I'm sure that that's going to be something that the coaching staff is going to be looking at throughout this week, to make sure that gets corrected, because those are the kind of things that, as the opponents get better, that you don't want that to turn into an issue, especially when you're on the road, in a couple weeks in Happy Valley, when it's almost impossible to hear, and Dwayne Haskins, could possibly fumble that snap. So I'm sure that there's a lot of things that can be corrected, but at least, offensively and defensively, they were able to work through it. And the special teams, even with the missed field goals, they had that partially blocked punt that contributed to that avalanche of points that were in Ohio State's favor.
Yeah, it was one of the things that got cut for length from my column, my grumpy old Buckeye column, was the low snaps. But it was I'd rather have them like that and have Haskins have to go down and get them than have those airmailed ones where they're over the head, and then next thing you know, you're running backwards 20 yards to go get it. I'd almost rather see them be low than high, but I'm sure that'll be fixed. That's the thing that really got me, is when everybody was like, "Oh, TCU's got Ohio State on the ropes." I mean, it was never more than 8 points, right, that they were down.
And I'm looking at it. I mean, at one point it was TCU 21, Ohio State 13, and that was in the beginning of the third quarter.
Yeah, and that was one of those things where going into halftime, you just said, look, Ohio State's made a lot of mistakes. They could just clean those things up, make a couple adjustments, and they're right back in this, especially knowing that their offensive line is going to wear down the TCU defense in the third and fourth quarters. And not just the offensive line, but it is hard to tackle Mike Weber and J.K. Dobbins, down after down, when you're keeping two guys like that fresh. In the fourth quarter, no gains in 2-yard runs are becoming 4 to 6 yard runs. I mean, that's just the way it's been. I mean, it was that way with, Beanie Wells. It was that way with Carlos Hyde. That's Ohio State physicality that takes its toll over the course of 60 minutes, and you knew that was going to happen. You knew that at some point the receivers were going to hang on to the football. You knew at some point the play calling was going to break out of that funk where they were just run it for a short gain on first down, throw it short on second down, and then set up a third and long, and then you're in trouble. You knew at some point they were going to start mixing things up and making some plays, and they did all of that. I want to go circle back to what you talked about Damon Arnett's pass interference. I'm assuming you were using air quotes.
That's very good. I mean, it just, and bad calls are they're gonna happen. Damon Arnett, I think you would agree with me. Damon Arnett is one of those guys where it seems like it's feast or famine with him. I mean, that pass interference call, and since you said to use air quotes, I am. I'm not. I just genuinely think, all right, it certainly didn't seem like it to me, but that contributed to, all right, he he's called for pass interference, and the next thing TCU, that's how they took the lead on that rushing touchdown that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, actually that's what I think it ended up making it 10-7. I think that's TCU's
right.
first score. So what happened was, here's what I noticed about Jalen Reagor, was that he was, every time Arnett was on him, his arm was stretched back and he had a fistful of Arnett's jersey every single time without fail. And okay, that's fair play if they're going to let that go. But on the play where they called the pass interference, not only was he holding on to Arnett, who had a better play on the ball than he did, but he also used leverage off of Arnett to try to go up and get the ball. And then when Arnett was his momentum kind of swung him around after the contact, then he made contact with Raygor, and it was like, what are you even calling here?
Well, that I think you would agree. There are many players in NFL history. Michael Irvin was one of the most notorious at that, the push off.
Yes.
And being able to, use that to their advantage. So Raygor, I agree with you. He did kind of, maybe not as blatant as Michael Irvin used to, but, he basically was able to get away with that. And unfortunately Arnett was the assigned culprit on that.
Mm-hmm,
But
yeah.
as I said, like the feast or famine, late in the fourth quarter, Damon Arnett had a crucial pass breakup that when Ohio State, they had the lead, looking at my notes that I have here, that was, late in the fourth quarter, that was, as you said, the offensive line that even though the running was tough at first, this was where J.K. Dobbins started to run the ball well. That's when Haskins was able to score the touchdown on the keeper that put Ohio State up 40-28. Mm-hmm. And late in the fourth quarter, Draymond Jones has a sack, and then Damon Arnett has a pass breakup. And those are the things that Ohio State, the momentum was clearly in their favor. So Damon Arnett, I'm sure, he is often the target of a lot of criticism by the fans, but fair or unfair, that pass interference, he definitely played well down the stretch when Ohio State needed it.
Yeah, I had no problems with the way that he played in that game. I thought he did well. The one discrepancy I had with and I don't like to harp too much on the officiating, but there was I think it was at the end of the first half before Ohio State had to settle for the field goal, a ball into the end zone to Johnny Dixon, and the defender not only grabbed on but turned Dixon completely before the ball got there, and that was not called. And that was kind of okay, well, they're going to call the thing on Arnett, but they're not going to call that. But I guess that's what you get for having a neutral site game 18 miles from your campus.
Yeah,
that home cooking.
yeah, but hey, Ohio State overcame it. They
exactly,
like you said, they were never out of it, despite what a lot of people on social media were proclaiming, and the idea that, as you said, Chris Fowler, that was a brave throw, and all these things that weren't really actually the case. Ohio State, they kept plugging along, because at one point they were down 21-13. We'd already mentioned Paris Campbell with the touchdown to make it 21-19. And then it was on the very next series, Draymond Jones intercepted the ball to make it 26-21. The next series after Ohio State kicked off, that's when Texas Christian, they tried that very creative kickoff return with the lateral, but that was called back. And on that same series, TCU, they had to punt the ball, which was partially blocked. Ohio State was set up in good field position. We talked about KJ Hill. That was a touchdown. Next thing you know, it's 33-21, as they said on television. That's 20 points in 4 minutes that Ohio State scored. And, Jocelyn Wint lost coverage on the next series on that, like I said, the not so brave touchdown that TCU scored to make it, it was Ohio State 33-28. We talked about Haskins scoring a touchdown on the keeper to make it 40-28. So the momentum definitely switched late in the third, going into the fourth. Ohio State had it, and it seemed like TCU they knew that they were kind of going uphill, so to speak, with their defensive line was getting worn down. The Ohio State defensive line, even with the absence of Nick Bosa, were starting to play well, and we already talked about Jordan Fuller with some of the stellar tackles that he was making at the line of scrimmage. Talked about Malik Harrison intercepting the ball late in the game. So both sides of the ball really, really rose to the occasion. I was really impressed with J.K. Dobbins late that final run that he had, where it looked like it was as you mentioned, the idea of like maybe a yard or two, and he kept his legs churning, and the next thing you know, it was like a 15-yard gain or something like that.
Yeah.
And he looked like a man possessed, very determined at the end. And I'm glad Ohio State didn't try to score. Just, you got the game won. There's no need to make this out to be anything, try to run up the score.
Right.
So it was a great game. It was enjoyable. And as I keep going back to it, this is the kind of game that I believe that Ohio State needs before they go into Big Ten play, especially before they go into Penn State, which is going to be a night game on September 29th.
Yeah, one guy I don't want to get out of here without talking about is Robert Landers, who really did a great job plugging up the running lanes for Ohio State in that game. I know Siwo Alonalua, I think is how you say it.
Yeah, I struggled with that one too.
14 carries, only 39 yards, and then Anderson had the one big carry for 93, but outside of that, only an additional 60 yards on 11 other carries. So I think for the most part, Ohio State did pretty well. Of course, they could have done a little bit better not allowing the big play, but I think only really two or three real explosion plays in the run game for TCU, and Robinson wasn't really much of a factor. He only carried it 8 times, and most of that was when he was flushed rather than straight runs. And then when he did keep it, he usually was bottled up. So,
right.
Great job by the defensive line. I didn't think Chase Young had a particularly great game, but I think he certainly helped pressure the quarterback in terms of making him go a different direction and run into guys like Draymond Jones and Jonathan Cooper in the second half. And so great job of the defensive line. I saw some good plays by Pete Werner. I saw some good plays by Tuff Borland. Certainly when Malik Harrison became the spy, which is something I was waiting for to happen, is it looked like the defensive line was doing well enough to rush 4 and keep a spy and then drop everyone else into coverage. And it seemed like that's what was happening a lot of the third and fourth quarter, and that's why TCU didn't have as much success, I think, as they had early in the game. So good adjustment by Greg Schiano, I think, at the half to do that, and also, good job by Harrison for the most part in keeping Robinson from taking off with the football. So Ohio State, of course, trailed at the half. It had been a while since we've seen that, and it's only because of a missed field goal. And then in the second half, TCU makes it, an 8-point game, and getting everybody around the country excited. Ooh, here comes the end of a horrible day for the Big Ten. And then you get the Paris Campbell pass, and that starts just the barrage in the third quarter. Draymond Jones picking off the shovel pass, probably my favorite play since the vacated Sugar Bowl interception at the end of the game by Solomon.
That's a good memory. If anything, I would it's a kind of thing where I'm hoping that Coach Brian Hartline, because Draymond Jones has not been shy in his public request to be an honorary member of Zone 6, for his reception and scoring. So yeah, and you mentioned Tuff Borland. Since Ohio State, we're going to be talking about Tulane here, but the next opponent, Ohio State already knows that they're going to be without Nick Bosa, and this is the kind of game where if it's just one person's idea that if at all possible, we talked earlier in some of the previous podcasts about Tuff Borland being on a limited pitch count. I would hope that this is the same kind of mentality going into the Tulane game, that, no sense in going into Big Ten play without Tuff Borland being as healthy as possible, because Ohio State knows they're going to need Tuff Borland against Penn State.
Yeah.
And why not? If I have no idea in terms of how Tuff Borland is feeling, but if Ohio State can get away without playing Tuff Borland against Tulane, that would be my preference.
Yeah. So let's just finish up the game a little bit. KJ Hill with a long pass from Haskins, 24 yards. Great play, a little bit back shoulder, good adjustment to the ball by KJ, who had a monster game. Makes it 33-21 Ohio State, and from that point on, you felt pretty good. They could just kind of slow TCU down a little bit. They probably should be able to run this thing out. And then, of course, the 51-yard touchdown happens because Wint gets he's in position, just can't find the ball, and just gives up the big play. And then so it's back to 33-28. But the killer really is the 8-play, 75-yard drive, taking up 3:36 that Haskins caps off with his 5-yard run. And then, of course, the defense takes over from there, stops them, and then Ohio State really kind of doesn't give the ball back much. It was the the earth movers up front, giving room for Dobbins, who was running, as you said, possessed in front of his home, some friends and family there. And it was great, a big win for Ohio State. I think the one thing that we probably should touch more on now, moving forward, before we head into the next thing, is Nick Bosa. I mean, when I'm sure like you, or I'm sure like me, you probably thought when Bosa went down, this could be trouble. This could be a difference maker that we didn't expect in the outcome of this game. But the defense really stepped up well. The entire defensive line picked up for Nick. And, Nick goes out with the team trailing, and then, the defense rallies and plays well the rest of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I Draymond Jones can't give enough positive comments about his play. I already said how he well-deserved Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. Mentioned Jonathan Cooper. I think we've probably are starting to take Robert Landers for granted. Like his solid play. Along the interior of the defensive line. I know that Chase Young wasn't nearly as involved in terms of like the overall pass rush, but certainly hope that Nick Bosa he's going to be out this game against Tulane. Fortunately for Ohio State, I think that the talent differential is enough that his absence is going to be more ceremonial than anything, but that he follows doctor's orders, doesn't rush back way too soon, because speaking for myself, yes, I want him back for Penn State, but oh, by the way, I certainly want Nick Bosa back for the November stretch run when Ohio State, when they're going to be playing against Nebraska, when they have to go on the road to Michigan State, to Maryland, and of course they've got the game at the end of November. So if it means that Nick Bosa is going to be missing the Tulane game as well as a few others because he's not 100%, I would rather be overly cautious, because that's the kind of injury that could lead to further, it can only not only be worsened, but also, even substantially more missed time when Ohio State would truly need him in the latter part of the season.
Yeah, the big question is how extensive is the injury? Nick, he played basically just over 2 quarters, ends up with 4 solo tackles, an assist, and a sack and a forced fumble for a touchdown. So his impact was felt. But speaking of impact, what does this mean for Ohio State's defense if Nick Bosa can't go for a month and a half or so? I mean, what if this is a sports hernia or something along those lines?
That's a completely different question. In terms of, I think it's one thing to go into playing against the Tulane Green Wave in the friendly confines of Ohio Stadium, and all right, well, you don't have him against Penn State and Happy Valley, you don't have him against Indiana, you don't have him against Minnesota and at Purdue. I'm kind of stammering to articulate what that would mean for the defense. I think, Chase Young is certainly blossoming into a very capable pass rusher, but he's not at Nick Bosa's level yet. This is probably not a news flash to you and probably not to our listeners of this podcast. There aren't too many Nick Bosas that are kind of walking around playing college football anyway. And there's a reason why Nick Bosa is the projected number one, if not the projected number one draft choice in 2019, one of the top options for the number one overall pick in 2019. So I'm not sure what that does to the Ohio State defense. I'm just going to try to emphasize to the Ohio State coaching staff, and I'm sure Urban Meyer is probably the same thing. We want to take our time and not rush him back, even though we're going to miss him. I think this is an opportunity for other players on that defensive line to step up.
Yeah. Speaking of Chase, not a single tackle in the game?
I didn't see it. I mean, I think he was contributing, though, in the sense that he was probably flushing people into Draymond Jones, into BB Landers, into Jonathan Coop. I think his presence was felt, but wasn't. Sometimes I read this a long time ago, and I agree with it. Sometimes, and this is going to sound like heresy. Sometimes some players, their contributions, the guy who winds up with the sack is the one who did almost nothing to get it. It was like the other player or players, flushing them into it. So I'm not suggesting that wasn't the case Saturday night. I'm just saying that Chase Young has that kind of talent that he could potentially, if he's rushing around the offensive tackle and the quarterback steps up into the awaiting arms of Draymond Jones and Robert Landers, I think Chase Young, even though he didn't actually get the sack, I think he's contributed with, the quarterback hurry, so to speak.
Yeah, and forcing the other team to respond to him and to account for him and to be aware of him on every play. That's what's so special about Nick Bosa, is that there was you could see it. They were drawing it up on the screen and showing what TCU was doing to try to scheme Nick Bosa out of the game, and in just half a game he still ends up with 5 tackles total and a big sack for forcing a fumble. So it goes to show you what a special player he is. Then I think they can turn their attention that they were turning toward Nick Bosa onto a Chase Young, and not quite at his level yet to elevate above what they're doing and make plays anyway. But yeah, he was a part of that defense. He was certainly part of what they were doing. He was certainly a part of gumming up the works for others to make tackles, as you said. So I just thought it was funny looking at the box score, and his name isn't even on the defensive stats. So crazy. I know I saw him out there. I'm saying, yeah. I don't know. Could be a mistake in the stats. I don't know. But I did see his tackle on here for him.
And yeah, and as we said earlier, I think the absence of Nick Bosa, as you said, it probably means more attention directed at Chase Young. That means more opportunities for Jonathan Cooper, more opportunities for Tyreek Smith at the within that defensive line rotation. So everyone is going to have to step up their game, but it's not as though when you think about somebody like the caliber of Nick Bosa, it's not as though other teams around the country have that luxury of being able to replace somebody who is a projected top 5 NFL draft choice. That's why I keep harping on the fact that at least this is not something that is season ending. It could be season ending if the Ohio State medical staff and coaching staff don't treat it right, but I have every confidence that they're going to do so.
Yeah, pretty good medical staff over there.
Yeah, pretty good.
All right, so big win, and before we get into this week against Tulane, of course, the big news is Ryan Day goes 3-0 as acting head coach, and now Urban Meyer is back, and of course, the first order of business is to go on ESPN and talk to Tom Rinaldi, and then have a big, longer than average press conference to talk about not very much football, as it turns out.
No, it wasn't much football, but I give credit to Jerry Emig and Urban Meyer for handling that press conference in the manner and fashion that they did, because the reality of the situation is, sick of it as we are of talking about it. The media is going to continue to harp on it, and the fact that Urban Meyer was not evasive in answering his questions, he tried to be as forthright as he possibly could. My personal opinion is I believe he handled it as well as he could. The national media, like you already referenced, like the Pat Forties of the world, I saw something on Twitter earlier that it seems as though nobody's going to be happy. I'm going to paraphrase whoever tweeted this out, so I apologize if I get this wrong. That basically, like the Pat Forties of the world, they're not going to be happy until Urban Meyer answers the question in the manner that Pat Forty wants it.
Right. Right.
That no matter how he answers this, and people were incredulous. What do you mean that you can't handle this on your own without talking to the people, and that you have to let the police handle it, and all these people just seem to think that Urban Meyer should have handled this much more intensely than he was legally allowed to do so. So could he have been, I think the credit I'm going to give to Urban Meyer is that he acknowledged he could have handled this entire situation much better than he did. Mm-hmm. I think Urban Meyer is with the benefit of hindsight, he knows that he should have been much more demanding of Zach Smith. He should have been much more involved in terms of letting the compliance people know ahead of time, and I'm sure going forward he will do so. But I just think that by going on ESPN, handling the press conference he had today in the manner he did, I think he's done as much as he possibly can. The people that want to, the spirits of discontent are going to continue to howl no matter what. So I think Urban Meyer is handling it as best he can. I think Jerry Emig, the sports information director at Ohio State, by allowing him to ask questions to the reporter's satisfaction, I think that was probably the best way that they could possibly handle this.
Yeah, and it wasn't a bunch of softballs. He answered some tough questions today, and not just today as we record this on Monday night. He sat down with Tom Rinaldi, and it's funny because if you watch that, it made you cringe a little bit at times, and then the release of the entire interview came out on YouTube, and it was like, wow, did they leave out a bunch of stuff that was kind of contextually important?
Yeah.
It is what it is. The E in ESPN stands for entertainment. Let's just get that right out there. It stands for entertainment. They're not the journalists they once were. So let's not even pretend they are. I mean, anybody that gives Stephen A. platform, that's not big on journalism. But it wasn't like, I think it was Marcus Hartman said that it was mind blowing what was left out. But I wasn't surprised because their narrative didn't fit what Urban was saying. So they had to edit it in a way that better fit their narrative. They're not going to change their narrative. They're trying to get their pound of flesh. I'm not saying they're out to get Urban Meyer. I'm saying this is what happens is you sink your teeth into somebody who's successful and you pursue it to the ends of the earth. And again, not journalism. This is entertainment television. This is it's almost a reality TV show, if you will. They call it unscripted television, but there's nothing unscripted about it. If you talk to anybody that's been on a reality show, so it's kind of like that. And it was I felt a little bit like I needed a shower after watching some of the way that Rinaldi framed some of his questions, but he's been at this a while. He knows what's effective, and he was doing his job. And then the edits came, and you didn't get to see him how vehemently Urban Meyer said if there was any domestic violence, he was fired. He knew it was fired. We talked about it. The stuff that I think was important to say, and the things that people wanted to hear. But then, today again, he came out, and I think this was today. The press conference he had today is the press conference that the way it should have been back on the day his suspension was announced. But he had been holed up in that room for 12 hours or whatever it was, and everybody just wanted to get the hell out of there, and nobody came off looking very good. In hindsight, it was handled poorly. They should have put off, this is what's happening, this is the announcement, we'll have a press conference tomorrow, and then they should have come back fresh the next day.
Well, it's one of these things. I'm not sure if you've ever heard this saying or expression, but there's this old saying about chew your words carefully before you spit them out, kind of, and the idea that don't rush into making a statement. Don't rush into saying something, because once you blurt something out, you can't get it back. And to your point of at the end of the 12-hour meeting that Urban Meyer looked very unhappy and angry at Ohio State President Drake and Gene Smith, and nobody came out looking well. That I agree with you that it would have been, all parties would have been better served with maybe not a good night's sleep, but at least some time to kind of cool down the emotions that were evidently running very hot that night of the Ohio State press conference when they announced Urban Meyer's suspension.
Yeah.
So I was pleased. I was pleased to see, watching the interview, the press conference with the Ohio State beat reporters, and I was pleased to see Urban Meyer, the sincerity that his respect he has for President Drake, for Gene Smith, about how vehement he was about, as you said, the idea of that I would be lax on the issue of domestic violence, that he was, for lack of a better word, rocked back by the allegation when it was suggested that his credibility was shot.
Mm-hmm.
That wounded him. I mean, who doesn't, who wouldn't be offended or hurt by the suggestion that people don't trust you? I mean, I would, if somebody suggested that about me, and I'm not the head coach of a major football program, that would hurt me, let alone, somebody like Urban Meyer. So I thought this was there's, as I said a few moments ago, there are always going to be people within the national media who are bound and determined to say how poorly Ohio State handled this. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I thought today was Ohio State's best effort and Urban Meyer's best effort at showing some contrition.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that there are people out there that are never going to be satisfied, no matter what he says, no matter even if the police report comes out and they show, hey, this is what we found, and there wasn't any probable cause to make an arrest, and this is why, and these are the things that happened, and even if all that happens, there are just still people that have convinced themselves they know what happened, even though they weren't there, and it's never going to be enough for them. They're never going to get their pound of flesh, and it's not sitting well with them, because it's all about winning nowadays. It's like if you've ever been involved, first of all, if you've ever been involved in a political discussion online, I feel sorry for you, but because it doesn't usually go well, because people dig in, and it doesn't matter if they're right. They've convinced themselves they're right. You can't give any evidence that they'll accept that they're not right. And then it becomes more about winning the argument than it does about, getting the truth. And it's kind of that way in this situation, to some respect. You can tell by the way. Before I even get into this, I do want to say one thing. I have a journalism degree, and I'm sure that most of these national reporters that ask this question a ridiculous number of times know the answer to this question before they ask him this. When they ask him, why didn't you talk to Courtney Smith? The answer is just the answer. The only correct answer to that is duh. You're not allowed to do that. Mm-hmm. You're not. You can't. That's called tampering. Like he alluded to it today. You're not allowed to do that. Your lawyer will say, don't do that. And everyone at Ohio State in compliance and everyone would have been saying, do not do this. And so it's disingenuous to even ask the question, because they know the answer before they even ask it, but they've been asking it anyway, because he's almost forced to look bad in a way by the way he has to respond. Because people are like, oh, what do you mean? What do you mean you weren't allowed or you couldn't? You know, because most people haven't been through journalism school.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't understand that. Most people don't have. I mean, if you talk to any lawyer, they're like nodding their head. Yep, you can't talk to them. That's an investigation's going on. You can't be, talking to people, getting, obstructing police business or any of that stuff. And it's not like it is on TV. You're not actually going and getting in the cop's way, physically or anything like that to be able to lay that label of interfering with the investigation. It's not like on the cop shows. It's a little bit different than that. So it's certainly bothersome that that's been going on, but in the end, I think today was a day when I think Urban Meyer, said everything he needed to be said, and he said everything that people have been wanting to know. He didn't duck anything, and he answered seemingly genuinely. I mean, who knows, what lurks in the hearts of men, but I think it's good that now we can probably move on until the next thing, stone gets unearthed, and that might be the Powell police reports or something else down the line. But yeah, the one thing that you can tell from this is something that Urban doesn't want to say this because it's not going to sound good, but you can tell that he does not believe that there was domestic violence involved in this case. And the only thing he has to go on, and people are calling this a cop-out, is the police reports and what the police are telling him and what the investigation turned up. And right now, I'm not saying Courtney Smith was or wasn't abused. I hope she wasn't. But the fact of the matter is no one has shown this to be the case. And it's something that, Urban would look bad if he came out and said it. So he can't come out and say it. But you can kind of tell that he doesn't believe that it happened.
As I agree with you that the police reports, the Powell police reports, that's going to be, if you want to think of it, that's going to be a very, very substantial piece of the story that is yet to be shared with it. Let me rephrase that it has bof discussed by throughout prior to Urban Meyer's suspension, like all of the back and forth in terms of between Brett McMurphy and Jeff Snook, and I don't want to revisit the whole thing because it was exhausting the first time.
Yes,
and it hasn't gotten better with age. But getting back to what you just said, because I completely agree with you, I think the Powell Police Department reports, when they are eventually released, because the truth always comes out, that when people get a better, more thorough, fuller, however you want to say it, view of the entire situation, it's might be wishful thinking from an Ohio State fan's mindset, but one could only hope that there would be someone within the national media that would say, aha, now I understand why Urban Meyer said, and make it like that, instead of, people are so quick to condemn without having the full picture. And as you said, you have a journalism degree. There are people within the legal profession who would agree with you that the idea of tampering with a witness, in this case it would be Courtney Smith. That's why Urban Meyer was very, very specific in terms of what he did and what he did not say. So I'm going to hold out hope. Maybe I'm naive. But I'm going to hold out hope that when the full picture is revealed, that people will be willing to acknowledge why Ohio State handled it and Urban Meyer handled it the way that they did.
Right. The final piece of this, before we move on, Chip, that kind of stands out to me is this: if Urban had fired Zach Smith in 2015, or if he'd never hired him, if he'd have fired him from Florida in 2009. The one thing we know in all of this is that if Zach Smith's fired or not, that doesn't protect Courtney Smith.
Yeah. And Urban Meyer, I mentioned how the idea of concern and contrition during his press conference on Monday, Urban Meyer repeatedly expressed concern for Zach and Courtney's children.
Yes.
I'm a proud father, and I could, from watching the press conference, I could relate to the fact what he was talking about. Like when you see people that have small children, and I've never met Zach or Courtney Smith or their children, but I have friends who have gone through divorce, and sometimes, and now without naming names or anything, like, it's never been nearly as hostile of a situation as it seems that Zach and Courtney Smith's divorce was. But anytime that there are small children involved, you always feel for the kids. And I think that's where Urban Meyer was kind of expressing his concern today in his press conference about trying to do what he thought was the right thing.
Yeah, and it's all anybody can do is in that situation. Is all you can do is what you think is right, and sometimes, as we saw with Jim Tressel, what you think is right is not right. But it's easier to look back on a situation and say what you should have done, and that's that way. That's just life. That's just the way life is. It's easier to look back on things that you did or didn't do well enough and say I should have done better at this. It's very hard to make that decision in the moment that's right, because you won't know until down the road. I mean, if let's say Zach Smith goes to counseling, shapes up, and everybody ends up having very harmonious relations from that point forward, then it worked. But you won't know that until you try it. And in this situation, like Urban said, he had enough red flags from a work perspective on Zach Smith that those mounting up, he should have taken some action. And again, if Zach was, whether it was stalking, whether it was harming Courtney, whether or not Urban fired Zach Smith wasn't going to protect her from Zach. That's just those two things are completely unrelated. It would have been better for Urban Meyer had he done it earlier, but it wouldn't have protected anybody. So, because I mean, it's not like he was going to come out and say that was the reason he fired him.
Yeah.
So even reputationally, that wasn't going to help. So I mean, to me, that's just it is what it is. It's an unfortunate situation for everyone involved, and at the end of the day, none of us still know what happened or who knew what, when, and really that's kind of buried in those Powell police records that will someday come to light, as you mentioned.
And just to kind of, we said this weeks ago, is that nobody is a winner in this whole scenario. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Courtney Smith, because her name and credibility has been, and her motives have been questioned, even by her members of her own family. Zach Smith lost his job. Urban Meyer was suspended and his credibility has been questioned. Ohio State, Urban Meyer apologized for everything that Ohio State had to go through because of this whole situation. So I don't see anyone coming out and being able to say, all right, this person came out better as a result of all this. And as we were talking about the idea that domestic violence is a very serious matter that is not to be shoved under the carpet and like swept under the rug, so to speak, that like, let's pretend it didn't happen. Okay, you have to take it seriously, but the way that this whole situation came about, nobody's coming out ahead on this whole thing. I don't care when the truth does come out, and as I said a few moments ago, that people hopefully will come to a better understanding as to why Urban Meyer handled it the way he did. At the end of the day, Zach Smith's still without a job. Zach and Courtney are still divorced. the whole domestic violence issue is still a problem. Maybe not for Zach and Courtney Smith, but for a lot of people in this country, and it shouldn't be. You know what I mean? Like it just seems like nobody comes out ahead in this whole situation.
Yeah, you're right. There's no winners here. There's only a whole lot of losers, and it's unfortunate. The other thing that you got to look at now is how quickly will coaches, not only coaches but employers of major companies or whatever, how quick will they be to pull the trigger on accusations now because of this, rather than wait to see if any charges are filed? Because we've seen what happened to Urban Meyer when no charges were filed. We've seen that this has affected his livelihood, his reputation, the reputation of the university, and it has made a lot of people look bad. And again, no charges filed. So now you're running the risk of the first hint of someone's gone, and now you've got lawsuits and things like that, wrongful termination. I mean, it's just it's a messy situation that's going to become messier as the ripple effects are felt, right? That's the way I feel about it.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's something that has to be taken seriously, but you also, I think, to be fair, you have to. It's a true tightrope in the sense of taking it seriously, but by the way, avoid rushing to judgment. And I think nobody, if as you said, beyond Ohio State football, I think within corporate America, within just within any walk of business, I think there's it's going to be a very difficult line to walk.
Mm-hmm. Well, at any rate, Urban Meyer will be back on the sideline for Tulane, and let's get into Ohio State versus the Green Wave. What do you expect, Chip? What kind of game do you think Tulane will be bringing to Ohio Stadium? Do you think Urban Meyer will be I don't want to say coaching angry, but do you think he's going to want to make a statement after Ryan Day went 3-0?
He might. I also, looking at to be fair, what I know of Tulane as far as this season goes is that Tulane is currently they come into Ohio Stadium with a 1-2 record. They lost their first game of the season 23-17 in overtime to Wake Forest, and then they won their second game quite easily over Nicholls State 42-17, and then this
Nicholls is not a state, Chip, just for the record.
I appreciate that. You're always looking out for me. But then in week 3, so this last game, they lost by a touchdown to UAB 31-24. So the point I was going to make is Tulane comes into this, yes, they're 1-2, but they're 13 points away from being undefeated. I mean, they, the first game losing in overtime, losing their last game by a touchdown. Now, I think getting back to your is this going to be Urban Meyer trying to make a statement? I don't think it's going to be so much Urban Meyer trying to make a statement as much as the talent differential that Ohio State fans like you and I saw in the first 2 games of the season against Oregon State, against Rutgers. I think it's going to be more than Ohio State, that they have so much more talent and so much more depth across the board that it's going to be very difficult for Ohio State not to rack up the points. I've mentioned this before, and I know that it sounds, kind of, snobby and condescending. I'm not meaning to, but the Las Vegas odds makers have installed Ohio State. When I saw this earlier today, and I'm not sure if the line has moved, Ohio State's a 34-point favorite. So where I say like this, the snobby condescending part comes in, is that the people out in Las Vegas, when they make these lines, I tend to believe them because I always see, very shiny new buildings and hotels continually being brought up in Las Vegas. Those people know what they're doing. I think Tulane's going to give it everything they've got. They've got a quarterback who's, in Jonathan Banks, His stat line, he's 48% completion rating. He's in terms of his physical stats, he's 6'2", 230. He's a junior. He's thrown for 5 touchdowns, 1 interception. But I think he's more of that, probably more of the runner versus the passer. They have a very explosive running back by the name of Corey Dauphine, he's listed at 6 foot 200. He's only run for 236 yards, but he's averaged 12 yards a carry in the games that Tulane has played. A couple big play wide receivers, Darnell Mooney, who's averaging 17 yards a reception, and Taron Ankalade, who's averaging about 23 yards a reception. But you go back to, well, who have they played? Wake Forest, they took them into overtime. They beat Nichols, don't call it a state. And they lost by a touchdown to UAB. But I think Ohio State, this is the kind of game, we re-referenced this earlier when we were looking at TCU. If I'm the Ohio State coaching staff, statement or otherwise, I think this is the kind of game where if I'm Ohio State, I'm going to play the starters through the first half, maybe a series into the second half if they've got a substantial lead, because that game against Penn State is looming large, and I would rather see Dwayne Haskins sitting comfortably on the bench safely, getting ready for the Penn State game. I'd rather see, as many starters as possible pulled from this game against Tulane if the game is well decided, rather than subjecting them to possible injury, because Ohio State already knows that there's a strong possibility that they're going to go into the Penn State game without Joey Bosa. We have no idea, kind of what the status of Tuff Borland, how his health is improving, but we want to keep that on the positive side. So I'm hoping for Ohio State to put this one away early and let some of those talented reserves play and impress Urban Meyer in his return to the sidelines.
Yeah, the Jonathan Banks, senior quarterback for Tulane, I'm assuming not the Jonathan Banks on Better Call Saul.
Yes, but who's to say that the Jonathan Banks from Better Call Saul, if he doesn't make a cameo, in terms of at least on the sidelines or something like that, who's to say he's not a big Tulane supporter?
So, you talked about under 50% passer rating, but his yards per game is pretty good, 217. They're running the ball just under 200 yards a game as a team, I think. So, but again, the opponents haven't been great, and this will be the best defense they've gone against, and it'll be on the road in a hostile environment. So, take all of that with a grain of salt. The fact is that they can move the ball, but they're only averaging 28 points a game, so they're not really getting in the end zone a lot. Their opponents are averaging about 24 points a game, I think, and again, not a murderer's row of opponents. So you would think that Dwayne Haskins and J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber should have big days and be able to go sit on the bench early and drink some water, kind of clown around on the sideline while other players get in the game. Maybe we see a third quarterback. Maybe we see Chug out on the field for this game at some point.
That would not be a bad thing. I'm not trying to sound the alarm bells, but I would rather get as many reps for Chug because I have a just maybe the memories of 2014 are still too fresh and vivid, but I would rather Tate Martell. He needs experience and he needs repetition, but if you're up, as the way that odds makers are predicting, if you're up substantially, let's let Chug get some reps too, because it's still too vivid in my mind that having to go to that third string quarterback, and I would rather Chug get the reps against Tulane when the game is well in hand in favor of Ohio State, versus having to come in, off the bench, into what could possibly be a very close nail biter type situation.
Yeah. So, Chip, what would you say is your score prediction for Ohio State versus Tulane?
I'm going to go Ohio State 56, Tulane 7.
Okay. I was going to actually say 56, but now that you've said it, I'm going to change mine.
Okay. All right.
um, let's see. I will go with 55. I'm going to say 7 touchdowns, a couple field goals.
Okay.
To 6. That's what I'll say.
Okay.
So pretty
55 to
close.
6.
Yeah,
Okay.
pretty close. I'm thinking
Okay.
they kick a couple field goals. Maybe the defense feels bad about allowing some big plays to TCU and maybe gets after them a little bit this week. And I think a lot of people will play in this game. I don't expect it to be close. It shouldn't be close. And if it's close, then maybe we have more concerns with being the proverbial valley game between TCU and Penn State, where you get that hole, that pit, and maybe you're looking ahead a little bit. So, but I don't think that will happen because I think Urban Meyer's return this week will prevent that from happening. But I can't speak, but what I will say is that I don't think we're going to see punts on 4th and 1 from midfield like we did against TCU.
No, I don't. I don't believe we'll see that. I will. I will be, I guess, maybe one of the lone people that understood the strategy there, because that was still during the time when Ohio State defensively had not yet cracked the TCU offense in terms of what they were doing and being able
Mm-hmm.
to. So I understand. I mean, I've got too much trestle in me that like the idea
Don't
of
get me
playing
wrong.
midfield.
I'm not saying it was a bad decision. What I'm saying is that I think Ryan Day may be a little more conservative than Urban Meyer. That's all I'm saying.
I would agree with you. The results spoke very well for Ryan Day. I would also believe that his phone is going to be quite busy come December. Ryan Day, I think he's going to have kind of the opportunity to kind of pick his next destination. I'm not sure where. I know like the rumors of schools that are already interested are starting to percolate. I'm not going to start paying close attention to that
Mm-hmm.
until actual coaching vacancies occur, because I don't think that's fair to the people that currently hold those jobs. But I certainly believe Ryan Day is going to be a head coach somewhere, not in Columbus, Ohio, but somewhere next fall.
Let me put this out there to you before we get out of here. What would you think about Ohio State putting this situation out there and pulling like what Florida State did with Jimbo Fisher and saying, "Coach in waiting, can you hang out here and be on our staff till Urban retires? He's probably only going to be a few more years." What do you think of that idea?
I could see it, but I also understand why they may not want to do it, simply because this is just, I mean, it has nothing to do with Ryan Day in terms of his coaching ability. It has
Mm-hmm.
everything to do with, I think Ohio State has been able to maintain their level of success by finding established coaches. We talked, throughout, like when you go back to, throughout Ohio State history, like Woody Hayes had been a head coach at Denison, at Miami before he became the head coach. And then, when you think about Earl Bruce, he had been a successful head coach at Tampa and Iowa State. And you keep going, up to the more current present day. And I've never ever suggested that it has to be somebody who has been a former Ohio State assistant, but I think
Mm-hmm.
the idea that it has to be a coach who is well versed in the culture of what Ohio State football is and the demands, and obviously Ryan Day, having been an assistant here, he would get that. I also think there's something to be said about, like Urban Meyer. I'm of the belief that Urban Meyer is successful because he had an opportunity to go to Bowling Green, to go to Utah, to go to Florida, and have, obviously he was successful almost immediately at Bowling Green. But I'm sure I've read and heard Urban Meyer say some of the things that he did at Bowling Green, like thank God he was able to do that on a smaller scale. And I just think Ryan Day, I'm not saying necessarily a MAC job. I'm saying that at a smaller, at another school, kind of getting some of the bugs and the quirks and the mistakes out of the way, that would better serve him for a triumphant return to Ohio State as Urban Meyer's successor versus being the coach in waiting. But we'll see. I mean,
all that aside, Chip, if Ohio State did that, made that announcement before the end of the season, would you like that announcement? Would that make you feel good, or would you not like it?
I'd like it, but I'd be surprised. How's that?
Okay. Fair enough.
How about you?
I think I would like it. I think this guy is talented, and I think that anytime you can lock up that talent and know what you've got coming up, I think that's great. I think when I can remember the uncertainty of before Tressel was hired, when everybody said, is it going to be Glenn Mason? Is it going to be this guy? Is it going to be that guy? And Tressel kind of came out of nowhere, and no one knew what to make of that. Then he made the appearance at the basketball game, and everybody went, "Oh, cool! This guy's cool." But he hadn't done anything yet, and of course, Jim Tressel was Jim Tressel, and he did a great job. But I kind of like it. I kind of like the idea of knowing who's next before that happens, because I think as this season has shown us, this preseason has shown us, you never know when Urban's gonna hang him up. I mean, you never know. I mean, this season could be his last. This entire situation could have soured him to the point where he figures, who needs this? Now, I don't believe that will happen. I don't believe that that's how he'll react. I believe he'll want to prove his doubters wrong. But even in, best case scenario, do you think he's here 5 more years?
No, I do. I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised if he was here 5 more years. I think he is holding out. I don't want to say just hope per se, but I believe he is building a talented roster that will get him another national championship, and that's when he'll be able to walk away feeling content that he was able to deliver a couple national championships to the school that he grew up rooting for, a school that he, as he said today, that he earned a master's degree from. And I think he'll be able to leave Ohio State on his terms, which is something you and I both know is not historically done.
Mm-hmm. And it almost wasn't done this year.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he wants to leave on his own terms, and I think that's a national championship. He's got more than enough money. He'll go into being a college football analyst for somebody. I don't know who, but could be our favorite 4-letter network, because he did it before. But this time, I think I think the idea of being Grandpa Urban, being able to do what he wants when he wants, I think that's kind of the mindset that he's going to have when his coaching career is concluded.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I will put this out there. You know who else was going to retire after he got his next national championship was Woody Hayes.
Yeah, that's true.
And that didn't quite work out really well for Woody.
No.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think that he's got maximum 5 years left, and I don't know that it'll be 5 years. And it could be substantially less. Who knows what's in the Powell documents, the Powell police documents. But yeah, I wouldn't mind having Ryan Day there, and knowing that even if Urban Meyer did coach 3-4 more years, Ryan Day would have all of that additional time learning from Urban Meyer, not only Urban Meyer, but the other assistants that he brings in, the Kevin Wilsons and the Gracianos. These are guys that Ryan Day's already learned quite a bit from. So I think it would be a great on-the-job training. And I think that Ohio State could do worse than to name Ryan Day a head coach in waiting. Although I know a lot of people hate that term and that situation, because then it seems like they're just a vulture waiting for the carcass to drop dead so they can start picking at it. But usually in those situations, it's been an older coach, and Urban's not like a kid, but he's certainly not like where Bobby Bowden was a few years back. So I could see it. It could happen, but I wouldn't bet on it happening. I think you're right. I think Ohio State would probably be happy to let Ryan Day go coach somewhere else, knowing that if you're successful, you've got a place here when Urban leaves.
I think Urban Meyer, I think if anything, he might have, like you said, he might be ready to, say, the heck with this, after everything that happened. But by the same token, he might have, some added fire in the belly to prove all of the critics and naysayers wrong.
Mm-hmm. And I want to throw this out too before we sign off. Right now, Luke Fickell is 3-0.
Yes, which is I'm happy for Luke Fickell. After everything we talked about in terms of somebody who was thrown into the deep end, not necessarily, I don't want to say ill prepared, but he wasn't. That was not the way that he wanted to take that that position.
Mm-hmm.
Luke Fickell. I think he kind of, to my point from a few moments ago, that the idea of going to a school like Cincinnati, which will allow him to grow and mature, and he's gonna, he had some rough patches last season, and as you said, we're only 3 games into this season, so we don't want to presume too much too soon. But for Luke Fickell to be off to a solid start in 2018, I feel very good about for Luke Fickell and for the UC Bearcats.
And Luke Fickell will host Tulane on October 6th. So we'll see how the two teams match up against Tulane, both Urban's team and Luke Fickell's team. But yeah, Luke going out and getting the big win over Chip Kelly at UCLA, and then winning at Miami 21-0. There's a soccer term for you, 21-0 at Miami of Ohio, and then a 63-7 win over Alabama A&M, which is apparently a school. So
yes. Yes.
So the big matchup, of course, a lot of big games coming up on Cincinnati's schedule, including Navy at home, South Florida at home, UCF on the road is going to be a tough one for them. Some big games, but it'll be interesting to see how he gets through it. I agree with you. Luke Fickell kind of had his team in a pretty good position, but then they kind of faltered stretch there in that zombie year that he took over after Tatgate, and he also had to deal with losing his starting quarterback, his starting running back, his number one receiver. So he had some stuff to deal with too, and his starting left tackle. So a lot of Fickell had to deal with that year, and still had them again. They were in, I want to say they were in pretty good shape to the Penn State game.
Yeah.
Kind of the wheels came off at the end of the season, but he had a lot of adversity to deal with in his first being thrown to the wolves, coaching stint. So it is good to see somebody who was a good steward of the program succeeding elsewhere. But as we mentioned before we came on the air, Chip, we're going to keep this short, and we didn't keep it short.
That's okay. Hey, we're keeping with it. We're keeping with the fine tradition of our colleagues, on the Ozone Radio Network. Tony and Tom.
Yes.
Their podcasts routinely run long, as well as Sons of Schmidt, and we're Buckeye Sloopcast. We're in good company that way.
Yes, check out all of our shows on the Ozone Radio Network. I particularly enjoyed how Tom and Tony were unflappable on their pregame show for the TCU game when the loud music would kick in and through the stadium speakers while they were trying to do pregame. It was very professional.
Yeah, well, they do it. They do a good job, and I especially like it when Tony takes credit for anything that Tom does or says. I'm sure Tom does too.
Good for them, and check them out. Please read our stuff at Hayes and Cannon. I write the grumpy old Buckeye column every week. We'll be back next week, Chip, to talk about Ohio State against Tulane and get ready for the trip to Happy Valley.
Yeah, that's not a big surprise, but a night kickoff. It was announced a 7:30 p.m. kickoff, so looking forward to it. But first, don't take your eyes off the Tulane Green Wave.
That's right. So that will do it for another edition of the Silver Bullets podcast. We appreciate you listening and subscribing and all that good stuff. So on behalf of Chip Minnich, I'm Michael Citro signing off for this episode the way we always do by saying, Go Bucks!
Go Bucks!